Hello, and welcome back to another Monday Science lesson with Headwaters Science Institute. Today is our fourth and final lesson during our Phenology unit. Next week we're going to mix things up with a different series about a different topic. Today we're going to be wrapping up this unit and looking at the data that you've collected for your research projects. Your homework for today is here. You need to make sure that you have collected all your data and have completed the background worksheet on your research project. We started out with the question and came up with a hypothesis as well as an experiment to investigate or test our hypothesis and question. This is what you've been doing the last 2 weeks. Now that we have our data, it's time for us to interpret our findings or analyze our data to figure out whether our data supports our hypothesis and answers our question, or maybe it doesn't support our hypothesis. A great way to interpret our findings and look at our data is through using a graph. We talked last week about how and why scientists use graphs, and if you have any questions on the type of graphs that you might make, you can check back to last week's lesson. During today's lesson, we are going to interpret our findings and then do these final 2 steps of the scientific process. The first is we're going to come up with new questions. Now that we've done our experiment and looked at our data, what new scientific questions do we have? The second part of the scientific process here is to share our findings with the rest of the scientific community. Science is built around this idea that researchers share their results of their experiments with one another. This not only allows scientists to build off each other's discoveries, but they can also repeat each other's experiments to see if the patterns that one scientist found hold true for a different scientist. We looked at the type of graphs you can make last week. You can review last week's lesson if you are still unsure what type of graph to make. I'm going to go over how you can make a graph with your data. To graph our data, we have to start by having all of our data in a spreadsheet. If you remember here, it's important to only have numbers or letters in your spreadsheet, never both. This will interfere with how your spreadsheet can graph. If you remember my experiment, I took a branch and I counted how many total tips there were on the branch, and then of those total tips, how many of those had a bud on them. I repeated this for 4 different branches on each tree, and for 12 different trees, 6 in the sun and 6 in the shade. One thing that I'll have to do is compare the percentage of buds to the total number of tips on the tree. I changed that. I already did that over here on this spreadsheet, where you can see I calculated the ratio by dividing the total number of buds by the number of tips. This number is here in yellow on each of those columns. The next thing I did was I took an average or a mean number of the ratio of buds to tips for each branch and put it over here in the blue. I calculated the mean by adding up all the ratios from 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then dividing by the number of numbers, which was 4. So now that I have the ratio of buds to total tips for each type of tree, I want to compare the sun versus the shady types of trees. I did one more thing to help us graph on the third sheet here, which was where I took the mean ratio of buds here in blue compared to whether something was in the sun or the shade. In this one, you can see I grouped all the ones in the sun together and all the ones in the shade together. This is going to make it really easy for me to calculate the average number or ratio of tips with buds for all my sun trees and all my shade trees. I'll do that now. I can type equals average and select the cells I want to make an average of to calculate the average in the spreadsheet. If you end up calculating your average by hand, that's fine too. I'll do the same thing again with the shade trees. And there we have it. We can see that in the sun, 75.4% of tips had buds growing on them, but in the shade, only 54% of tips had buds growing on them. This will be what I'll make my graph out of. Do you have any guesses as to what type of graph this will be? A bar graph or a scatter plot? This will actually be a bar graph because we're comparing one type of number, the ratio or percentage of tips with buds on them, in different categories, sun or shade. To make my graph, I'll select the cells that I want to over here and go over to where it says Insert and choose the chart function in Google Sheets. If you have any questions on how to do this, you can always look through the instructions that are linked in the description of this video. This gave us a sideways bar graph here, but we really want a vertical one. We can change this over here under Setup and choose a different type of graph that will give us what we want. As you can see now, it's really easy to see that the sun had more buds in it than the shade did. If you remember back to the first lesson, you'll know that my research question was, do plants in the sun have more buds than plants in the shade? My hypothesis was, plants in the sun will have more buds because plants need sun to do photosynthesis. Once I have my graph on here, it's really easy to test my hypothesis and figure out whether it was true or false. For me, my hypothesis was true. However, if your hypothesis was false, or maybe your data didn't prove your hypothesis one way or another, don't get discouraged. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. This happens to scientists all the time. The important thing is that you understand what your data shows you and you reflect on your experiment, how you could have improved it, and what other things you could do to better test your original question. We're going to move on to the next step of the scientific process, coming up with new scientific questions. What I want you to do is take a moment and write out answers to these two questions. Keep a hold of these questions because we're going to use your answers later on at the end of the lesson. The first question is, how could you improve your experiment to better test your question? What could you have done differently in order to collect data that might help you test your question? The second part of this is, what new questions do you have? Oftentimes, when scientists investigate a new system, they learn things about it and come up with even more questions. You can pause this video while you work on finishing your answers to these two questions and restart it once you are ready to go. Nice work, everyone. Now that we've graphed our data and come up with some new scientific questions, the last part of today's lesson is to create a scientific presentation so you can share your results with the rest of the world. Scientists use presentations like this not only to communicate their findings and what new knowledge they found, but to describe their experiment so another scientist could do it and see if the patterns that we found hold true when someone else does the same experiment. To make this easier for you, we created a presentation template that you can find linked in the description of the video below. I'm going to walk you through this presentation template, and the good news is that many of the questions in the presentation template are the same questions that you've had for homework during the past few weeks' lessons. The first slide in your presentation is a title slide that also has space for your names and your school. Your title should be a short description of your research project. The second part of your presentation is your introduction. This is where you'll give your readers some general information on the subject of your research. Let them know why what you're studying is important. Many of the answers that you came up with on background research about your plant last week for homework will be useful here. On this slide, you can include your research question and hypothesis. The next slide is where you tell people how you did your research project. You want to give just enough information that another scientist could do the same experiment and include any scientific materials you used. You don't need to include things like pencil and paper because those are well-known items. On the next slide, you can copy and paste the graph that you made in Google Sheets here. Be sure to write a one-sentence caption at the bottom that describes the patterns and the strength of those patterns in your data. Make sure all your graphs have proper titles and labels for each axis. The biggest part of your presentation is your discussion section. This is where you tell your readers what your graph and results mean. Answer each one of these 5 questions to complete your discussion section. When you're done with the discussion, you can delete the prompts on this slide and leave your answers in full sentences. The last slide in your research presentation is future research. These answers are the ones that you came up with earlier in today's lesson. How could you improve your experiment to better test your question? And what new research questions do you have now that you've completed your experiment? You can type your answers out here. Your homework for this week has 2 parts. The first part is to finish your scientific presentation. Use the template we just showed you and answer all the prompts on each slide. The second part of your homework for this week is to complete the scientific process by sharing your results and presentation with the rest of the world. Share what you've done with your parents, your classmates, or me at spencer@headwatersscienceinstitute.org. That's all for this 4-week lesson on phenology. I hope you all learned something new and got to investigate some really cool plants living around your home or outside. Next Monday, you can tune back in where we have a different mini-series that you can investigate, and it's going to feature some really cool, cute animals. See you all next week!